My name is Tracey Holmes. I work for the ABC right now. I'm also a professorial fellow at Canberra University. It's really great to be here and be part of this. And I'm glad I actually got the first flight out of Melbourne, because some others that thought they could get the next flight out still aren't here. Hence, we have a different makeup to what is published on the brochure. And if this qualifies as media, I guess the message is don't believe the media, right? Because things change. But look, it's my great pleasure to be facilitating this first session. And I'd like to start with a few words of welcome. Yirudu marang nadu yinjamara gadigal lain, nadu yinjamara gadigal urumban. So I'd like to pay my respects to the Gadigal people and the Gadigal land that we're on, and also to any other Indigenous people in the room with us today, and of course to everybody. So the incredible rise of women's football, and I think it's so apt after just seeing that video about the fact that there's an invisibility. And I've even been watching it at this World Cup, despite all of the fandom and the incredible recognition and the support. You look down on the ground, and I was at the Men's World Cup in Qatar in November, December last year, and I took photos of the photographers' bank. They line the sideline. It's about 10 deep and about 100 long. At the Women's World Cup, you only need 2 hands and 2 feet, and you can count all the photographers that are down there. So that means the number of photos that are being sent through agencies all around the world, or to newspapers all around the world, is going to be shrunk by that much again, even though we can see the support is there. So once again, it's a media responsibility that hasn't quite kicked in to the level it needs to be. So on today's panel, I'd like to introduce first Jessie Davis, recently retired, and 6 weeks ago won the Danish Cup. Jessie, congratulations.
Thank you.
And welcome. Dr. Gabriela Garton is probably no stranger to many of you, from Melbourne Victory, Argentina national team, and Victoria University. Welcome to you. Professor Jean Williams from the University of Reading, and JJ Heritage, specialist in sports history, particularly women in sport, and some incredible fashion down the back. I'm going to walk out with all of them. Please welcome Jean. And of course, Professor John Nauright. Welcome to you. And congratulations on organising the event.
Thank you.
Okay, so let's start with this rise. And I guess the starting point is the historical perspective. Let's start with women's football. Where did women's football begin? Out of what did it emerge?
Is it working?
Yeah.
Women have always played football, so it's a common perception that women's football is new, progressing and developing. We heard the narrative just then from Rebecca. And one of the things that I'm going to counter in this conference is the idea that women's football is making any kind of progress. If you think it's making progress, then please articulate what you think the end point of that progress is going to be. So I'm a little tired of the narrative of women playing catch up. Me too. Women's football is new. Before football was codified by the FA in 1863, there was women's football all over the world, and in fact, a very ancient form of football in China called shuzhou, which is thousands of years old. We would think of it today as like freestyling. So there have been those kind of forms of folk football that women have always played, codification in 1863, and then we know of games in England from at least 1881 onwards. So the idea that women's football is new and progressing and developing is a constructed narrative. Basically, in England in 1921, the FA banned women's football from its pitches for 50 years. And in Australia, that had a disproportionate colonial effect in terms of the perception of women's football, and other, as we know, other football codes took over. So women's football is not new, it's not progressing, it's going through changes and continuity. So let's set the tone for the day and talk about those continuities and changes.
I like that, because I was speaking to an academic in Queensland just last week. She's from Brazil, and she was talking about the ban of football in Brazil, which only finished in the 80s. you know, but they kept playing anyway. And so when we talk about this rise, I think there's an ignoring of the fact that every time you step up, there's another door that slams, right? There's another door you've got to try and break down to get to that next level, and it keeps developing along this route. What about the other panelists? Like, do you agree with Jean? Like, is this what we're looking at? Are some of you more positive? Do you see the glasses half full, or is it exactly right?
I'd have to agree with Jean. I think it's evident that we're reaching new levels of, or newish levels of fandom, I suppose, and filling stadiums again. I think it's important to say, because with one of the first unofficial World Cups, the Azteca Stadium in Mexico was full, like with over 80,000 people watching a women's football match that wasn't sanctioned by FIFA, but it was a football match. And high levels of participation, all over the world, until like Jean mentioned, official ways of banning the game, but also in countries like Argentina, the game was never officially banned, but it was definitely not socially sanctioned for women to participate. And that's held women back, from really being able to achieve, obviously, the levels of protagonism that the men have been able to achieve, especially in countries like in South America, where you see the men's national teams achieving extreme levels of success, but the women never really quite being able to break through, which, I mean, hopefully we'll be seeing changes. But I think there's certainly, as women begin to achieve these new levels of attention and success, and hopefully also new levels of financial growth and stability, there will be pushback, I think, as well. Like, I think of football, speaking about Argentina again, as being a really key part of building a national masculine identity, what that means for women to break into that space, and why then that would generate such pushback as well from society and from certain powerful groups as well. I think it's important to think through, but I do want to have a positive outlook, and I do want to think that these things can change. I think that the new wave of feminism and the way that this has also been able to partner with the growth of women's football, that hopefully we can make women's football get to a stage where we want it to be, and have it stay there as well. But I think I like Jean's question about making sure we know where we're taking the game as well. I think it's a really important question. Do we want to take it where men's football is, or do we want to make it something that's our own?
Yeah, I was just going to ask that. Jessie, maybe you want to comment on that. Because the way the game developed for men and women has been different, and yet what we're doing is applying the same media narrative to the women's game, and yet the women's game brings so much other stuff because it was born out of social justice and the situation through the war, and then fundraising. It's always stood for other things. What do you feel like as a professional player? Do you want it to be the same as the men's game? Do you feel like it's the same as the men's game? Or do you want it to be seen differently, discussed differently, viewed differently?
It's a complex question, and certainly these two are much better versed in the history of women's football. I've mostly just been a player, but I do see it as being a different product, and certainly in playing over the last few years, it has to be judged differently. We have so many fewer resources in the women's game, and in general, for example, I'll take the team that I played on in Denmark. It's sort of this mix. It's considered a professional team, but it's a mix of semi-professional and professional, because you have a majority of the players who are either in school still, so still in their version of high school, or trying to make it work with university, which is almost impossible with women's professional football. And then you have a small subset of players who can truly commit to being a full-time player. So we have a men's team, so it's easy to draw a comparison, who show up in the morning at roughly 9 a.m. They have breakfast, they have a very leisurely morning where they can have a meeting, they can go through their preparations for the training, they can go through their training, they can do a lift, they can have a second team meal, and they're there from roughly maybe 8 to 2. And that's it. The rest of the day, they can go home, they can recover, they can carry on their lives as such. Our women's team, on the other hand, gets there at sometimes, now it's adjusted a bit over the last few years, but sometimes as early as 5:40 in the morning to complete a strength program, to then go to a team meeting before the training. You're out on the pitch by 7, you're off the pitch by 8:15. If you want to do an individual session, you have to work it in before the gym switches over so that the men's team can come in and train. Then you also have to choose, do I do my strength program or do I eat breakfast because the kitchen's going to close because they have to switch to lunch. So just in there in your average morning for a women's player, you have so many different considerations. And then beyond that, you have to worry about going to school for 8 hours, going to work for 8 hours. And so at the end of the day, if people ever say, well, the women's product just isn't as good, well, how could it be? We're doing 5 other things. Oh, by the way, my teammate just had a baby, doesn't necessarily have the resources to get back into the game. Whereas our men's players have a game in the morning, have a baby in the afternoon, no problem. It honestly has happened. So the narrative behind it is just, it is completely different. It's a different product. I certainly think it's just as exciting as the men's game. There was a report that was released earlier this week. I'm not sure if it was The Guardian or on BBC, but it was, statistically speaking, the women's game is just as entertaining as the men's game because of the amount of goals that are scored, the possession. There's far less time spent rolling around on the ground for injuries, et cetera, et cetera. So certainly the product is different. The quality can be the same, but we need more poured into it before we can expect women to be operating at the same level as the men.
John, from your perspective, if women are pursuing the same end goal with a different framework built around it because of all of those things Jessie was just talking about, but you know, equal prize money, equal coverage, equal whatever, are we confusing 2 frames? Should we actually be discussing those 2 things differently? Because a number of men have stopped and spoken to me at a number of these games at the Women's World Cup in various cities. And I thought it was interesting that they would come and give their comments. And basically they said they enjoy watching the women's game more because they said there's something raw about it that they can really relate to, which they've lost touch with the men's game because it's in a different kind of stratosphere. And so are we in danger of losing what is wholesome and different about the women's game by pursuing the same end game?
Yeah, I think, you know, with respect to the kind of differences that exist. So if I go to my club team, Aston Villa in England, and I want to see a player, I have to stand behind a fence, hope to see them get out of their luxury car and walk into the stadium. Whereas the other night, after the match that Denmark lost to England, there was a Danish woman player out on the field greeting fans more than 30-45 minutes after the match in a World Cup match. So the accessibility is completely different. I think, you know, to Jessie's point, in terms of equality, it needs to be where the training regimes, the facilities, the coaching, the scientific support is for women's football or women in football, not just for football. And I think that's an absolutely vital point. If we want women's football to kind of succeed and be viewed in a sense as an equal product. But I think we're getting to the point where now we're beginning to see in a number of sports that will say the men's this and the women's that. To me, that is progress because there are differences. For example, I've talked to Jessie and a number of other players about how the football boots aren't designed specifically for women, that some of the equipment that is used has just been adapted. And so we still have a lot of progress that needs to be made in terms of research, in terms of coaching, in terms of products that are geared for women in football.
So you mentioned success there. Jean, how should we be viewing success? What is success? If we were to get to the end goal, what would that be? What would that look like?
For me, one of the best models around the world right now is not the Women's Super League in England, which UEFA recently brought out a report to say is the best league in the world. I think that's a highly contentious point of view and not one that I would support. So I think what Angel City FC are doing is really, really interesting in terms of it being female owned and female led. It's an explicitly feminist team. Obviously we know some of the biggest entertainers in the world are involved in launching that league. High profile women who recognise that actually the entertainment industry is incredibly sexist. If you're an older actress trying to get a part in the entertainment industry in the US, it's incredibly difficult. So what they're doing is they're forming their own production companies. And once you own the means of production, not to get too Marxist about it, but once you own the means of production and you own your own production companies, then you can define how that product is articulated. And I think compared with that, Angel City lose every week. They're not the best team, but they give back enormously to their community. So the fans turn out week in, week out, consume the product, fill the stands, sing along, because they believe in what the club stands for. The Women's Super League, in comparison, as a sub-brand of the English Premiership, which is just about to be sold off to the English Premiership, is hugely problematic, especially considering the sports washing that's going on currently in the Premiership. And I suppose we will talk about Saudi involvement at some point, but yeah, that is problematic for me.
So yeah, success, winning, all of it is wrapped up into the same sort of thing. And I've actually seen an example of that, a couple of matches here where the losing team is not so devastated. Obviously, the players are devastated and the fans, but it's momentary. They have gone out and started celebrating with the winning team, which you don't often see in the men's game because it is all about winning. And so this is where it becomes difficult though, doesn't it? Because when FIFA is looking at world sport and trying to improve the women's game and looking at the men's game model, it's all about the money. And how do we balance that when it's not all about the money, because there's value in these other things? And I think societies are just starting to come to terms with that, aren't they? That we're seeing the collapse of some sectors of society because our focus is only on the money. Gabriela?
Yeah, I think that's actually kind of what I have from my own playing experience has been what I've most enjoyed about football. Like I think you can ask most, if not all, professional female players what their motivation is behind playing, and money will not be a factor for most. I think, you know, that's the ability to build these relationships that you do share with teammates. It's the ability to create social networks, to learn you know, how to overcome difficulties, how to it's sport, you know, we all think most of us in this room love sport, and that's why we're here. You know, it obviously not have to preach to the choir, but it teaches you, and you do take a lot out of sport that isn't necessarily financial. And you know, I think to a certain extent in the women's game, it's also, you know, I think seeing images of players hugging after the game, it's like everybody knows that even though you're at different points in the struggle, we're all in the struggle together as well. And I think there's certainly an aspect of sorority that occurs in women's football that you don't see in the men's game, because, you know, you're not fighting for, you know, kit that fits you. You're not fighting for minimum standards at your club. You're not fighting for, you know, just a little bit of respect from you know, your club administrators or even from the media or from family. Like even like there's players that don't have the support of their family to be able to play. So you get that from the women's football community. And I think that's something that's special. And I don't know, like as the game grows and maybe as, you know, I think new generations that might not be having to go through those same struggles, I'm not sure what impact that's going to have on, you know, this aspect of the women's game. I know that like from a player association perspective, there is, I also work with Pro Players Association. We've been doing some things with, you know, some player unions around the world. And there is this sort of generational gap that is occurring because you have players that are coming in, some clubs anyway, that are provided with the resources that they should have from the get-go. but they haven't gone through that struggle, and so there is kind of this, you know, I don't know if it's concern, but certainly distance or disconnect between some of the players that have gone through that struggle and then these new generations that haven't. But at the same time, I think these new generations, now that they have the expectations that they should be treated as professionals, I think they're not going to accept kind of the things or the mistreatment that a lot of older players have had to, as you know, a way to cope with, you know, to be able to continue in the game, you had to put up with it. Otherwise, you know, you would just have given up a long time ago. But I think, yeah, I think that kind of, I don't know if wholesome is the word to think about the way the women's game is, but certainly that more relatable aspect, I think, comes a lot to do with that struggle as well. So yeah, I don't know, it'll be interesting to see as time moves along and things become more professional and that struggle maybe starts to go away, whether you can keep that aspect of the women's game. And also, I think the dual career aspect that Jessie was speaking about, is that something that, you know, we should strive to get rid of, or is it something that we should strive to foster as well? Like allowing, is full-time professionalism dedicating yourself 100% to the game, or is it, you know, being able to have the choice to study if you want to and have the support of your club to carry out a university education while you're playing, being able to work in something that you enjoy while you're playing, as well as be able to have that easier transition into retirement too, because I don't know that we necessarily want to go the path of exclusive professionalism the men's game has gone towards, where basically players are discarded after they've retired and kind of, you know, left to struggle to find a new identity after their whole life has been wrapped around football. So yeah, I think there's a lot of things to think about as we move towards the future.
I'm also conscious of the fact that a lot of the discussion that we have is really centered around the rich, predominantly white nations as well. And there's a lot of countries that are nowhere near even where we are. And you don't even have to go to another country. You can look inside this country, and there's a lot of communities that don't have access to the sorts of things that maybe everyone on this panel has had access to, and many people in the group. And they often get left out of the conversation. And we have a conversation at this level. Even yesterday, somebody was saying to me about something that had happened on the pitch, and they were talking about, you know, but what about the optics? And what about, you know, wellness has to come first. And I said, it's interesting because for some people, you've got to be rich before you can start talking about wellness. You know, there's a lot of people where it's survival, and who cares about the optics? Because if I win this, I can send my kid's sister to school. And that's a very different discussion to the one that we're possibly having right now. Jessie, why have you retired now?
That's a loaded question. So I could enjoy the World Cup. That's why I retired now. Yeah, and well, I'm 35, and I stopped playing for several years when I first graduated from university, and I took a break in the US. And in that time, I went back to grad school. John is my professor, and spent a few years working before I got back into it. It's not an easy lifestyle, and I certainly think that media glamorizes it, but then also we players glamorize it too, because you sort of see the highlights and the snapshots of the wonderful moments, and not so much the difficult ones. So yeah.
And so that's an area where, you know, the media gets bagged, but in fact, if you were honest about some of the difficult moments, people would understand that,
Yeah.
wouldn't they? But
Yeah.
there's a thing that is kept inside the bubble.
Yeah, certainly. But retiring now was mostly just because I got a better opportunity, and that's to become the sporting director for the club that I'm playing for. And had that not come through, it would have been easier for me to kind of drag my feet a little bit and maybe extend one more season. I think, as you mentioned, there is a little bit of an identity crisis when you go from being a player to being a professional. And unless you've taken the route, which I have, which has always been dual career, you might retire and not have any options. Fortunately for me, I did, but part of that is because I chose that pathway, as you spoke of. If I had dedicated, you know, the last 10 years just to being a footballer, and at the end of the day, I was 35 and didn't have anything to fall back on, I think right now I would be struggling quite a bit longer. or quite a bit more. But at a certain point, you want to be able to do all the things that your lifestyle in football hasn't afforded you. And I mean, financially afforded you, amongst other things, but certainly financially. I haven't been able to live my life because of my football contracts, my football salary. It's always been the work outside of it. And sometimes I've honestly worked, you know, a full-time job outside of football and then 2 contract jobs, just to kind of be what I feel like the rest of my friends who are my age, the experience of life that they're having, where they're going on vacations and things like that. Certainly, we've all signed contracts that have been survivable, but not where you feel like you're actually having a quality of life. So in order for me to do that, I had to do more. So by 35, I'm working several jobs for the last few years to make it work. It was just time to do it, and it felt right.
John, you're going to publish your book soon. Just tell us a little bit about that and what that says about this very topic. This topic of, you know, the rise of women's football, because I think actually what we're hearing is that it's like an incremental step up and then a plateau, and an incremental step up and then another plateau. So how is your book going to, you know, talk about that?
Yeah, I'm writing a book at the moment, which is a cultural biography of Sam Kerr. And it's the first time, I think, and there's a session sort of devoted to Sam and to the Matildas. But I think we're at an inflection point where we're now seeing that female team athlete superstars are getting recognition. At the same time, we don't want to forget, you know, we have a panel where 4 of the women on the panel are American-based players who played in the university system, who have played in several different countries. And so to kind of move from contract to contract, like Jessie says, they've had an opportunity to play, but they're struggling down at this level. Now for the book on Sam Kerr, I think what I'm really focused on is, you know, how and why particular female athletes get covered at certain levels. And, you know, some of it is to do with how brilliant she is on the field, how brilliant her backflip is, you know, that she has a unique style. And that's something that I think is, you know, she and the players around her have become role models for young girls and many young boys who are following women's teams. So I think it's something to be celebrated. At the same time, you know, I think that, you know, her success, and let's face it, she's in football because she couldn't play on an AFL team because there was no girls team. She wanted to play, you know, she wanted to play Aussie rules like her brother. And that was her sport, and she was brilliant at it. And she didn't even like soccer at first, you know, but she's written this series of books for girls who, at the same age that she switched codes, tells her story. And so we're beginning to have this kind of role model effect that leading players can have. I think if they take that responsibility quite seriously, and I think we've seen from the England team, from the Australian team, and certainly from the American team for quite some time, that the leading players have kind of accepted that role model status and really tried to do their best to push the game forward.
You wanted to talk about sports washing, Jean, and I think this is interesting because if we're talking about the future of sport, it's most definitely, you know, wound up with where the money is, and the money at the moment is the Middle East. And I'm always a bit dubious about the term sports washing.
Okay.
Only because I think, you know, England and our colonial masters have used sport very well for a couple of 100 years to do exactly that. And I don't see it as being any different. It's just a power shift. But please tell us what your ideas on sports washing are and where it's going, where the future of sport is going with that.
I couldn't agree more. And the reason why I'm wearing what I'm wearing is that most of you will know my work as a historian, and I think we're at a particular juncture. So this is my 7th Women's World Cup, obviously very different than what was happening in Los Angeles in '99 to some extent, where we got the first soccer Barbies. You would see the first guys walking into restaurants with their daughter on their shoulder, they'd have a Nike shirt on, the daughter would have ham on the back of her shirt, the dad would have ham on the back of his shirt. So we saw those kind of feminist fathers 20, 5 years ago now, 24 years ago. I think we're at a particular juncture where FIFA and the national associations have always viewed women's football as an economic liability and men's football as an economic asset. Suddenly they're going, oh, 2023, how can we exploit women's football? And certainly within the UK, you get the banks like Barclays, who have entered into women's football sponsorship. We wouldn't have had that if they weren't trying to rehabilitate their image after the economic crash of 2008. So we need to look at why Lego is using Sam Kerr to try and sell their product. Who is moving into women's football? We were in the fan zone last night, and it's McDonald's, it's Coke, it's the major brands who are looking to have a piece of women's football. So one of the things I'm trying to reflect as a historian is that actually women's football has its own culture and its own history, and we could reimagine it in different ways. So the garments that I'm wearing are upcycled and recycled clothing of my own. I came up with the idea of Millie Brighter's Captain Brightside, got somebody to illustrate it, put it on a t-shirt. That's my particular fandom. I'm not buying Nike shirts at $150. So I think it's for us within the women's football community, and I've known many of you for a number of years, to go, well, if we want a different future for women's football, how are we going to articulate that? What are the values that we want to take forward? Do we want to be buying Nike shirts? Do we want to be buying Coke? Do we want Visit Saudi to sponsor a Women's World Cup? And we have a voice, and we have the potential to do things differently as consumers. So not to be preachy about it, because I think it's really important to kind of defend your joy in women's football. And I know it gives us all a lot of joy, but just to be mindful consumers, and you don't have to follow the model of men's football.
So someone came along and said, we really like that shirt. Can we mass produce them and sell it for $25?
No, the point is that there's one.
Which makes it worth 500, right?
Yeah.
Gabriela, just a comment on that, the future, where the money comes from. Should we be chasing the money? Can we do it without the money? And I guess this comes back to FIFA and the way, it's not just FIFA, it's most international governing bodies of sport, who then feed down to the national governing bodies inside each country, and that chain and how it's performed, and what it is that they seek, and how they can grow if it's not with money.
I think it's difficult to do things without money, but I certainly think that, there is a way to do things differently. I think,
does it require though women almost having their own thing on the side? Like, I'm conscious of the fact that in Australia there was an Australian Women's Soccer Association, the same as there was an Australian Women's Cricket Association, and when they started becoming popular and successful, and it looked like, hey, there's a thing, the men wanted to merge. Does it require that? Does it require Billie Jean King to do something independently before it can come together equally?
I mean, I think it is really important, like what Jean was talking about before, what Angel City has been able to do, having women in positions of, that are making decisions. So I think having women in positions of power in those federations, women who care about women's football, because it's not just a matter of putting a woman there because she's a woman, obviously. Like, I think you need people in those positions who care about the women's game and care about female players as well, and taking that game forward. I think, we could say that's something that's missing right now in the A-League's competition as well, something that's really focused on bringing the women's game forward, and not just worried about, salvaging the men's game as well, which is kind of in a difficult spot here in Australia. But I think that's a challenge when you're going into places where, there is a lot of power that's in play. When you think about FIFA and a lot of the member federations, it's really difficult for women to find their place there and actually have a say, not just not just being in the organization. I know like Moya Dodd has spoken excessively about, you know, her role within FIFA and the difficulties that she faces as a woman there. But I mean, I think you can look at different member federations and see similar things. Like I coming from Argentina, I find it really hard to imagine a woman in AFA making decisions about the women's game. And I think to a certain extent, so 2019, women's football was professionalized in Argentina. And I say professionalized because there were only 8 contracts per team that were being funded by AFA, but most clubs were only providing those 8 contracts. Only some of the bigger clubs have more than 8 players, which isn't even, you know, a full squad in an 11-a-side. So, but this decision to professionalize the game came following quite a bit of organic movement and collective action by players, including legal action by one player who was, you know, suing her club and the federation to have her relationship with the club be recognized as a working relationship. And to a certain extent, I think, you know, Jean's talked about this in her own work, but when the game begins to become successful on the women's side, and when there's, you know, the power balance is shifting, that's kind of when a lot of these existing organizations want to come in and almost control that growth. I think in Argentina, that growth has almost been smothered to a certain extent. Like, you know, and everything that's happened is almost in spite of those in positions of power. So I think it's certainly challenging because there is kind of a gatekeeper situation that occurs in terms of moving the game forward. In Argentina in 2022, Boca Juniors was playing Guayaquil to define the winners of the domestic league, and Boca Juniors opened only a part of their stadium, and those tickets sold out like that, 25,000 tickets gone. But if they really believed in the game, and there were people in that club that were making decisions to bring the game forward and to, you know, like I said, had the interests of the players and the game at the forefront, they would have opened the whole stadium because they would have that belief that it is something that people are interested in. But because they only opened a part of the stadium, you know, still 25,000 people attended. And then a week later, Belgrano, which is another club in another province in Argentina, they were playing for promotion into the first division. So not even, that wasn't even a professional team at the time. This was only first division, which was supposedly professional. They opened their whole stadium and it was packed for the season final, 28,000 people filling a stadium. So they broke the record that Boca Juniors had set the week before. So clearly there's interest and clearly there are people that want to be there. But I think a lot of it again is like, who are in those positions to decide then what, once there is money there, what is done with it and how we can make sure that that is invested in a way that is ethical and also, you know, the best interests of the players and, you know, the fans as well.
So how important then are player bodies, player associations? And Jessie, you might want to comment on this, because I know in so many other industries, you know, association or unionization is kind of decreasing, but in sport, it still appears to be really vital because some of these changes will not happen without the player bodies arguing for them so vociferously.
Yeah, certainly there's power in the movement of the players. In Denmark, we have a players union where they're desperately trying to beg players to join it because, again, as I mentioned, a lot of the players are young. They don't know what they don't know. And as you mentioned in the beginning of this conversation, they walk into the world that some of us older players have created for them where they think, you know, I deserve this, which we know, yes, is very true, but we had to work really hard to get there. It wasn't just given to us. So you have to continue pushing these organizations. And in women's football, it's this really interesting dichotomy between being grateful for what you have, but absolutely wanting to push for more. And it's just this narrative that's constantly, you need to be grateful, you need to be grateful. And yes, we are, but we need to demand more. But I know of a player who recently played in Greece and was asked to throw a match as a goalkeeper. And she ended up, you know, having to leave the team. She wasn't paid. And then she's a Danish player, and the Danish Players Union was like, we can help with things like that. And she had no idea. So it's those sorts of organizations that can support when you don't know where else to turn, and you don't know what you don't know. So we also heard from Becky Sauerbrunn on a podcast a while ago that the US women's national team was willing to just be a support to the Canadian women's team when they were putting the fight against the organization. So again, that's something I think that's a little bit different in women's football than in men's, the players supporting the players. But certainly that's where I think we can make the changes, but we do need women to continue to buy in, and that's even the 16-year-olds who are signing their first professional contracts. They have as much responsibility as older players too.
So I'm conscious of time. In closing, I'd like each of you to give me, if there was one thing that could make a difference so that this rise, instead of just being a step up like this, could actually go like that much faster in the next decade. What is the one thing that needs to happen?
For me, it's quite simple. People just need to come to games and become fans. It's really easy to say you're supporting women's football, but then you go to a pub and there's no one else in there. And so I think people need to sort of put their money where their mouths are and actually get out and support and learn about players and just show face.
John?
Yeah, I think back to Jean's point, it's absolutely crucial that women who are interested in the success of women's football retain elements of power and control. Giving that up causes significant challenges, as we can see. But there are pockets, not just Angel FC, but now for the first time, a majority ownership in a women's club that has a men's brand, Olympic Lyonnais, has been bought by a woman, the woman who owns Washington Spirit, who now has multiple properties, but is doing it in a way that is promoted and has the interest of the women's game at heart. There is a real danger, as we know, and if Benita was sitting here today and not Crook, she would be telling you, we have to watch FIFA and ensure that FIFA doesn't try to make the women's game a carbon copy of the men's game and extract as much wealth out of it as possible.
I'm gonna go back to the player union part. I think having player voice moving forward is so key. I think that's the balance as well, that that's what would keep hopefully FIFA in check is the players. At the end of the game, there's no game without the players. So I think that making sure that players have a role in making the decisions about where the game is going is really key. And yeah, I think also the point that John was making is important as well, like making sure that women who are interested in the game take those big steps and invest in football. And I think that's sort of hopefully what will be the difference. I think organizations like FIFA are a little bit scary in that they kind of do what they want, but at the end of the day, again, there's no football without players, there's no money without fans. So FIFA without us is nothing. So at the end of the day, we've got to be the ones that kind of take the game where we want it to go.
It's sort of like the trick of politicians, isn't it? We think politicians are really important, and actually they're not. They're just elected officials elected by us to do a job that should be supporting us and in our best interests. So it's almost inverting that model and retaking or reclaiming some of that power. Jean?
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, it's about resource and expectation. And I was never an elite player, and I'm not grateful. I'm not grateful if FIFA triples the prize money, because triple of a small amount of money is still a small amount of money. So until there have been 9 FIFA presidents, all male, since 1904. I would love to see a female president, the likes of Moya Dodd at FIFA, and I would like them to halve the resource. It'd be a simple, radical thing to do, to go, okay, well, we've got all of this resource, let's halve it, half for the women's game, half for the men's game, and look at the dramatic effect that would have on the women's game, particularly the women who didn't even get to qualify, by the way. Many of the African nations, Women's World Cup is disproportionately Eurocentric in the 13 out of 32 slots that are allowed. And I've done some field work in Namibia where the women say to me, the National Association is not even going to fund us to qualify, let alone any chance of us getting on a plane to a World Cup. So until we look at the governance at National Association level, until we look at the way that FIFA is using resource and keep being critical about that, I think that this is the first content World Cup, Women's World Cup, where, you know, we're getting a lot of those funny little videos with hearts and butterflies and things that are not really engaging with the really difficult issues that there are this World Cup, because the industrial action around this World Cup is the most bitterly fought that I've seen in the 7 that I've attended. There is not one association who's not battling for equal pay or against a sexual abuse case or some kind of harassment. So let's keep shining a light on that and be critical in our comments as well as enjoying football.
Yeah, would you please thank our very wise man. So we have a break now for tea, coffee, water, toilet break, whatever you need, or walk outside in the fresh air, and we'll be back in 15 minutes to start the next session. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tracey.
You guys are. No.
Thank you.